one of the most well-known and iconic images from the Bible. A young man who's wearing tattered clothing is stinking like a pig farm, shuffles down the road, blisters on his feet from his long walk. He's gaunt, so skin and bone at this point, and he's rehearsing a speech to himself over and over again. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Suddenly there's a man running toward him, an older man, well-to-do, well-fed, a man of dignity, a man of rank. But right now his dignity is forgotten as he runs to this ragged young man. They meet, there's this huge embrace. The young man begins his speech, but the older man isn't listening. He's calling to his servants. The next thing you know, there's a huge party. They're singing and dancing and the finest foods. In the middle of it, this older man stands up and says, "Friends, we have a reason to celebrate today. My son who was once dead is now alive. My son who was once lost has been found." It seems like the perfect ending to the story, a way of saying, and everyone lived happily ever after. It's a story of repentance and redemption, a story of love and grace. Everyone listening to Jesus' parable must have assumed the story was over. What a great conclusion. But Jesus is the master storyteller. He's not done. I imagine taking a dramatic pause before saying in Luke chapter 15, verse 25, "Meanwhile, the older son." Meanwhile, it's a classic storytelling technique. The whole time, this has been happening, but meanwhile, over here, something else is going on. There's another character in the story. We need to know what he's up to. Some of Jesus' listeners would have recalled that he began the story by saying there was a man who had two sons. Up to this point, the entire story has been about the younger son, the one we call the prodigal, the one who demanded his inheritance, went off to this distant land where he lived wildly and blew all of his money. But the existence of two sons was not just extraneous detail. Jesus included that for a reason. So we're going to find out why. Before we look at the rest of the story, we need to pay attention to the original setting in which Jesus told this parable. Back in the beginning of chapter 15 of Luke, we read this. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." There were two groups of people listening to Jesus. The first, tax collectors and sinners. Tax collectors were hated because they worked for the Romans. And sinners were, that's just an obvious phrase, what that was all about. These were people who were more like the younger brother. They were living in the distant country, far from God, living wildly. And they were far from their spiritual home. The second group is called the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. These were people who held to the traditional morality of their upbringing. They were careful to keep the religious rules. They were fiercely loyal to God. So they find it disconcerting that here Jesus is, this rabbi who's bringing new teachings, and he is hanging out with these people that just are not someone a good, godly person should be with. So they mutter to themselves, does he even know who these people are? Does he get the kind of people he's eating with? And in that culture, to eat with someone was very significant. You did not eat with someone who was of ill repute, someone who was not a clean, holy type person. So Jesus hears their muttering and responds by telling three stories. First of all, he tells the story of the lost sheep. Remember the shepherd's got 100 sheep. One of them is lost. What does he say? Well, 99 is pretty good, right? 99 out of 100, that's not bad. No, the parable, Jesus says that he goes searching for that lost sheep. And when he finds the sheep, he brings the sheep back, and he has a celebration. My sheep has been found. Then there's the parable that follows it of a woman who's lost a coin. Now, to us, a coin is, penny, nickel, quarter, big deal, right? Maybe $1. But back in that time, coins, maybe it was a gold coin, something of real value. And this lady, she searches and searches until she finds it. When she does, she's excited, and she wants everyone to know her lost coin has been found. And then Jesus follows it by this story that we've been looking at over the past 5 weeks. It was the story of this young man who demands his inheritance from his father, and then takes his dad's money and goes and lives wildly and blows everything, living a life of sin. And so that brings us to the place where we are today. A place where now we're going to also look at the older brother. If the story had ended after verse 24, and the feast, the father's toast, the lost son, I think the Pharisees probably would have been okay with that. The religious leaders This isn't exactly their image of God, a God who was searching for the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost man. More they're into Jesus, into people who are holy, people who act right. But still, they would have been okay. But Jesus now brings it in to let them see that, they are part of this story also. Because the whole time the story seemed to be about just these lost people, these sinners, these unclean people. But verse 25, Jesus says, meanwhile, and we realize he's also been talking about the scribes and Pharisees all along. They're in this story. They are the older brother. Here's what Jesus says in verse 25. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother is come, he replied, and your father has killed a fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So the father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. You never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. As it turns out, this is not the parable of the lost son. It's the parable of the two lost sons. This father had two boys. Both of them were far from him. One of them had gone far away and left him. The other one had stayed home, yet his heart was far from his father. It was turned away from it. This is an interesting twist to this story. It's an interesting twist to our sermon series. Some of you have never really been prodigal. A couple of weeks ago, I led Glenn Petruski's small group, the group that meets Thursday nights, the Bible study at the Ministry Center. Glenn was away, and so I led. So as we're talking about this and I'm asking questions, I kind of realized from the answers that some of them, prodigal is not something they really understand that well. Some of you today, you grew up in a great Christian home. Your parents loved God. They were wonderful, godly people. They brought you to church at a young age. You gave your life to Jesus. And you really have lived your life. Now you've not been perfect. And certainly in the sermon series, you've seen ways in which you have wandered from God. And you've remembered times when you walked away. But you don't really identify with the prodigal. You more think of people you know, maybe family members or friends. And yet the reality is this parable is for all of us. Because sometimes we're more like the older brother. As we unpack this, most of us need to listen carefully. As John Piper says, this is a passage for longtime churchgoers. This is a passage for people who don't struggle as much with running from God as they struggle with condemning those who do. This is a passage for people who tend to think of other people who need this passage. The older brother judges his younger brother. He's always lived right. He's done the right things. And older brothers often do that. If you've ever read the Birth Order book, it's a very interesting book, and Kevin Lehman, and it really, there's so much truth. It talks about the typical first child. Typically, and again, everyone's different, but the average, and I've seen this over and over again, typically the first child is very obedient, they listen well, they're calm, they're quiet, they do what mom and dad says, and we as parents feel like geniuses. Man, look at my kid. I am at that family with 4 kids, they're crazy. My kid. And then you have your second. And God humbles you. And you suddenly realize you're not as smart as you thought you were. And maybe you should stop giving advice after all. But the second one often, they're striving for attention, so they're going to do more things to get your attention. The first one always had your attention. They had never known anything but your full attention. The second one learns early on they've got to get mom and dad's attention. And so there's such a difference. I see in our sons. Older one, Joel, very focused, very, never gives you a problem ever. David's a great kid. Anyone who knows him, he's a lot of fun. I so enjoy him. But David, I would say you keep a closer eye on David. What do you do on Joel? And when David does stuff, sometimes Joel, his older brother, is just like, oh, David, why would you do that? He gets so frustrated. Well, the reality is, many of us act like the older brother in this parable. We judge those who fall. We judge those who sin differently than we do. So here's the point we need to get today. If we're trusting in our own goodness to determine our relationship with God, we are just as lost as those who rebel against God. The problem with the Pharisees, the problem with the older brothers, they thought it was their efforts, their goodness, that made the Father love them, that made them acceptable to God. They were trusting in what they could do. So they were just as lost as these sinners who at least realized they were lost. So how do you know if you're like the older brother in this passage? Well, Tim Keller in his book, The Prodigal God, says there's 4 signs of what he calls elder brother lostness. The first is anger toward God. When life doesn't go their way, older brothers often aren't just sad about it, they become bitter and angry. The beginning of verse 28 says, the older brother became angry. We fall into this older brother type thinking. We begin to believe that if we live a good life, then our road should be smooth. If we live for God, we shouldn't have any real problems. We think God owes us. Now, all of us, of course, ask when something bad happens, why would God allow this to happen? That's human nature. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's when we take the step further and ask, why, God, did you let it happen to me? I don't deserve it. Those people over there, they deserve it. I don't. And then we start to enumerate to God all the reasons why we deserve only good things. And then we begin to question, Lord, why don't I have good health? Or why am I not making a lot of money? Or why is my family not better? And we turn to bitterness or anger. We shake our fists at God. We use words like, Lord, I've earned it, or I deserve it. We're now thinking like the older brother in this parable. D.A. Carson writes, we must acknowledge that some people who think of themselves as Christian also think their relationship with God is of the you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of reality. He says, provided you're good enough, you'll get happily married. Provided you read your Bible every day, you'll have a long life and you won't get cancer until you're at least 96. Provided you're honest at work, you won't lose your job, unlike the people who deserve to lose their jobs. Provided you always say your prayers, your kids will never rebel. God, you scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours. The problem with this is we are presuming that God needs something from us. We're presuming that God's up in heaven going, man, I hope Mark comes through on this. Really counting on him here. God doesn't need us. And he doesn't owe us anything. It's out of grace that he loves us and cares for us. So if we're counting on our goodness to pay off with divine favor, we are bound to become angry and resentful when everything fails to go our way. The second sign of being like the older brother is a misplaced pride in our own goodness. When we see others who don't behave as we do, we have a heightened sense of our own moral superiority. Notice how the older brother talks about his younger brother here in Luke chapter 15, verse 30. He tells his dad, but when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with a prostitute, comes home. So he's saying it disdainfully, what has happened? He says to his dad, this son of yours. Parents, you ever said that? Right, this is a mom and dad thing typically to say, right? When your kid does something well, you go like, oh, did you see what our son did? Oh, did you see what our daughter did? What happens when they do something wrong? Do you know what your son did? Right? My mom used to always do that. I was her son until I did something wrong. And then she'd tell my dad, your son did this. And that's what the brother's doing here. This son of yours, not my brother, it's your son. And he says he squandered your property. He wants to point out this guy's mistakes. And then he says, with prostitutes. He wants to make it clear to Dad, look how bad of a younger brother this is. Look what a terrible son. In other words, what he's saying is, look how good I am, Dad. Really, look at me. I haven't done any of these things. I've always been good. I've always been here. There are people who think they have the right to decide for God who belongs to him, who belongs in the church, who he should forgive, whose sins he should let go of. And they display this kind of older brother pride. If we pull out the microscope to examine every flaw in the lives of others, we need to be careful because the same microscope will be used on us. If we condemn others without being acutely aware of our own sin, we are merely condemning ourselves. Keller writes, if the older brother had known his own heart, he would have said, I'm just as self-centered and a grief to my father in my own way as my brother is in his. I have no right to feel superior. And then he would have given his father the freedom to forgive the younger brother. But elder brothers don't see themselves this way. The third sign of elder brother lostness is joyless service. We are constant and dutiful in our ministry for God, but there's no delight in it. We serve God out of obligation, not love. Verse 29, the older brother says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. All these years he's been working for his dad. He's played the role of the good son, but now he reveals the truth. He's seen it as slavery. He feels like his father's the master and he's the slave. He didn't get the relationship. He doesn't understand his father. John Piper writes, this is not the way the Father wants his children to relate to him. This is a distortion of Christianity. It dishonors God to treat him as a master in need of slave labor. What honors God is not slave labor, but childlike faith in his all-sufficiency. Well, he goes on then to quote what Jesus says about himself in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, when Jesus says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Piper then continues, Jesus did not come and hang out a help-wanted sign. He came and hung out a help-available sign. Jesus is eating with sinners because he is a doctor with a cure, not because he's an employer with a labor shortage. The Pharisees and scribes couldn't see this because they themselves had a totally different mindset. For so many years they thought, I've been serving you and I've never neglected a command of yours. So Piper concludes, test yourself here. I fear that at this point many might say, it seems to me the older brother really has a legitimate complaint. Don't you sometimes feel that way? I remember growing up hearing this parable and I always thought, yeah, he's right. That's not fair. And if that's what we're thinking, then we're missing the entire point. We're thinking the way of master and slave, of earning goodness, not the Christian way, of father and of being a child and living by faith. So the question here is not whether the son really has kept the commandments. The question is, was he right to relate to his father in that way? Did he really understand who his father was? Kyle Eilerman writes, the Father's house is not a house of merit. It's a house of mercy. And that's the great news for those who've fallen flat on their faces. And it's a stumbling block for those who've grown up so good that they feel like they're holy in and of themselves. And they don't need God's forgiveness. If we're serving because we have to, if we're obeying God because of rules and fail to delight in being his children, we're missing the point. We've misunderstood the Father. God is a God who loves and cares about us. And that brings us to our fourth point, which is that elder lostness we see is when we doubt God's love for us. Though we stay close to home, we're never certain God really loves us. Here's what the older brother says in verse 29. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. So even though he's been living under his father's roof all this time, he still doesn't know him, his father. He doesn't get his dad. He does not believe his father's generosity extends to him. Now please understand, this statement says a lot more about this son than it does about his father. From this parable that Jesus is telling, it seems he's a good dad. He loves his boys. He cares about them. I guarantee if this son had come to him and said, Dad, I want to have a party. Could we kill one of our goats and I want to throw a feast with my friends? Dad would have said, sure. So it wasn't that the father didn't care. It's that the son misunderstood and misrepresented his dad. He had wrong assumptions about him. Keller writes, as long as you are trying to earn your salvation by controlling God through goodness, you'll never be sure you've been good enough for him. You simply aren't sure God loves and delights in you. But God does love you. He loves you if you're the younger son. If you've wandered and squandered so much of your life, he loves you and wants to offer forgiveness. He loves you also if you're like the older brother who's often stiff-necked and proud and feel good about yourself. He loves you too. God the Father cares about you. Both groups here need to hear that they are lost. Both groups need that aha moment that we've been talking about over the past 6 weeks. That awakening of realizing something's wrong. The honesty to admit to God, Lord, here's what I've done and I've failed you. And then finally the action of then moving forward in life and taking steps to live for him. Because we need to understand this, that God welcomes all of us with wide open arms, just as he ran to that son, walking up the dusty road and had his arms open, the same way his arms are open for all of you. Even though both boys had wounded their father's heart, even though both had wandered away from him, still the father's love was there for them. Now this man in that culture had every right to tell the younger son, when he says, Dad, I want half of your estate. Imagine parents, one of your kids coming to you and say, Mom and Dad, I want my inheritance now. First of all, we start to laugh. Wait, you think there's going to be anything left when I die? Wow, you're an optimist. You are really an optimist. No, what'd you say? Are you kidding me? What am I going to live off of? Father could have said to his son, get out, especially in that culture. Out of my house. I don't want to see you again if you're like this. And then when the older brother's out there on the porch pouting, oh, you never loved me like you loved him. You always treated him better. Right, parents? We've heard that, right? We've done it ourselves when we were kids. Could have said, I'm sick and tired of your whining. I've loved you. I've taken care of you. Get out of here. I'm tired of it. Is that what the Father does? No. The Father responds with love and grace in a way they did not deserve. You know, in verse 28, the older brother, we're told, became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. Dad goes out and says this. My son, the father said, you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. Lord, son, look around. All the rest, this is all yours. He says, but we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. There's reason to celebrate. Christianity Today magazine, Robert Capon wrote, you're worried about permissiveness. You're worried about the way the preaching of grace seems to make it okay for people to do all kind of terrible things as long as they walk back in afterwards and take the free gift of God's forgiveness. And while you and I may be worried about seeming to give permission for sin, Jesus apparently wasn't. He wasn't afraid of giving the prodigal son a kiss instead of a lecture, a party instead of probation. And he proved that by bringing in the elder brother at the end of the story and having the older brother raise the same objections that you have. He's angry about the party. He complains the father is lowering the standards and ignoring virtue. That when he has music, dancing, and a fattened calf, in effect, he's giving permission to go break the law. And to that, Jesus has the Father saying, we're not playing good boys and bad boys any longer. Your brother was dead, he's alive. The name of the game now is resurrection, not bookkeeping. And so Kyle Adamman writes, God is a loving Father who longs for his children to come home. On the day you finally come home, you'll find him waiting for you. See, God longs for a close relationship with us. He's watching, waiting. His eyes scanning the horizon for us to return with love to the one who loved us first. You know, he loves you even if you're still trying to get away from him. He loves you, and he can't wait for you to come home. In the book, Aha, Kyle Adamman shares the story of a young man in college. The guy wrote this. 8 years ago, I left home and went to Colorado State University. I was in a fraternity, and I majored in partying. For the first 3 semesters, I never stopped and thought about what I was doing. I wasn't praying at all. But after 3 semesters, reality came crashing in on me when I flunked 4 out of my 5 classes. I had a wake-up call. I knew I had to make some changes. I needed to get out of the fraternity and lose some of my friends, but what I really needed was a change in my relationship with God, if he would ever have me back again. In the frat house, there was no place of privacy to make the phone call to my parents, explaining that I had failed. And so I took the phone into the bathroom. I called my parents and explained to them that I had blown it in a lot of areas of my life, not just in my grades, but also in my walk with Christ. I had strayed from him. And my parents listened to what I had to say, and then they said 3 words to me. They didn't say, turn things around. They didn't say, make things right. They didn't say, get some help. They didn't say, figure it out. They just said to me, just come home. Friends, that's what the Father says to us. Stop trying to figure it out on our own. Stop trying to be good enough on our own. Just come home to him. Some of you need to come now. You've been living in the distant country, and this past 6 weeks, God has been calling you back home to the one who loves you. Others of you have never left home, but you've been living in pride. And what a good person you are, how you've lived your life. You've tried to be good enough to earn his love, but his love is not for sale. It's a free gift. And so if you're like the older brother, you need to open your arms and understand it's because of what he has done. Remember in college, my best friend was Fred Staten. Fred was this amazing, wonderful guy. And Fred also grew up in this amazing Christian home, and he was like as pure as the driven snow. I mean, Fred just really, he was everyone just looked up to Fred, and he really was just such a godly man. And one of the things he was so proud of is he had never missed chapel. It was a Christian college, 3 times a week we had chapel. No one was taking notes, no one was checking on us. But on our honor, we were supposed to go. And it's his senior year, and Fred has never missed a chapel. And it became a big thing. Everyone knew, whoa, Fred's never missed chapel. You know, chapel time would come. Whoa, Fred, are you going to come? And you know, one day he said to me, Mark, I'm skipping chapel today. I said, Fred, you're what? You're going to skip chapel? He said, you know what? God convicted me. That I've been making this into something. Look how wonderful Fred is. Look how holy Fred is. Everyone looks up to Fred because I've never missed chapel. He's like, I'm going for the wrong reason, if that's the reason. And so Fred skipped chapel that day. Some of you, you've been so good. You've lived your life right all along. It's so easy to hold on to that and be proud of yourself. Friends, Jesus is looking for lost, failed people. He's looking for people who maybe have done pretty well. Man, you look in your heart and you should see the sin that's there. And if you don't, there's a problem. Remember Billy Graham, who I respect so much, talking about how much of his life he realized how much he'd failed and how many ways he'd sinned. You think, Billy Graham, what a great guy. No one's good enough. You know, the sad thing about Jesus' story is this. It ends with a cliffhanger. Younger son, what happens to him? He comes home, right? Leaves the distant country. He comes back to his father who's waiting. Dad throws a party. But then the older brother is outside. Won't come in. No, Dad, I'm not coming in. I'm mad at you. Look at him. And the story ends with the older brother still outside. We don't know. Did he soften his heart and realize the father's love was freely given? Today, I would encourage you, soften your heart. Let God come and work in you. Let's pray. Some of you here, you're